what I'm going to try to do here this afternoon, with your help, to do a kind of a tour d'horizon of the Obama administration's efforts to deal with the Middle East. I was all set to offer you a blistering indictment of Obama's dithering Middle East policy, to quote the word given to it by Turki al-Faisal, the Saudi prince. And I was ready, as befits an academic, to give him a grade, which would have been a D. But after watching Obama's State of the Union speech Tuesday night, and I expect some of you did also, and after listening to my very good research assistant, who happens to be a Syrian American and no admirer of U.S. policy, who said I was being too harsh. After all, he's much better than W, she said. So I must confess to you my ambivalence, but I do think I'll raise the grade at least to a gentleman's C, because despite evidence of failures and setbacks wherever you look concerning Obama's Middle East policy, in some ways what he's trying to do is, I think, probably worthwhile. Whether he can succeed in doing it skillfully remains to be seen. So we're going to go over a number of policy areas. Coming from Singapore, I have to say I am really tired of hearing people talk about American declinism, but that's what they do. And I think this is true not just in Singapore, but throughout Asia. We've done various joint activities with institutions in China, Japan, Australia, and you hear this all the time. So it was interesting, in light of all that, to hear President Obama, especially Secretary of State Kerry, speaking recently at Davos, saying, no, that's not the case at all. And they insist, Susan Rice, we've heard the same thing from her, that America is not in decline, not diminishing its role in the Middle East in favor of Asia. And having listened to that it really does appear that he is scaling back American involvement and perhaps even interest in the Middle East. That's at least what I took away from the State of the Union speech, of which about 1/4 only was devoted to foreign affairs, although a good part of that 1/4 did, despite everything, concentrate on the Middle East. But if we are scaling back, or if we're required to play a less prominent role, this is not necessarily such a bad thing, in my opinion. And I think I agree with John Mearsheimer, who wrote recently that the American fixation on dominating the Middle East as if it was ours has been on the whole very expensive and has not brought the returns of transforming the Middle East into a pro-American and democratic and stable sphere of influence. The centerpiece of his Middle East accomplishments, of Obama's Middle East accomplishments, is basically downsizing, getting rid of things, disentangling us from, and definitely scaling down the range of policy priorities. And it was interesting watching the speech that he got a lot of applause from the Congress and elsewhere when he talked about getting out of Iraq, having gotten out of Iraq, and trying to get out of Afghanistan. So that's all very well, but when I was in Beirut about a week ago, I got an earful from Lebanese friends who said, in effect, where the hell is the U.S. when we need it? And I've heard a lot from friends in Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states who accuse Obama of dithering. That was Prince Turki Al-Faisal's word at a speech in Washington 3 months ago. Dithering on Syria and Iran. And paradoxically, the U.S., having previously been roundly excoriated in Arab public opinion for imperial ambitions and interference, this is a leitmotif that goes way back to the beginnings of when America kind of replaced Britain as the dominant hegemonic outside force in the Middle East back in the 40s and 50s, he's now ridiculed in many Middle Eastern, what we like to think of as friendly quarters, both from regimes and from oppositions, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, as well as from familiar enemies like Iran, Syria, the jihadists. If the criteria for good foreign policy was popularity, then Obama would indeed deserve that grade of D. But of course it's more complicated than that. So let me talk a little bit, just to remind us, about what the administration says it's doing or trying to do. Talk a little bit about what others think of that, going case by case. Then perhaps asking, how do we explain what on the whole I think is a mediocre performance? Why is it? Why can't we do better? And then I have a few sort of concluding things to say. So we start off. Let's start off with the most recent statement, the State of the Union speech of January 27th, and in which President Obama, while denying decline, he nevertheless has narrowed the agenda to 3, possibly 4 main themes, main priorities. And these were withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan, trying to curb Iran's nuclear military ambitions, if they have them, taking on the Palestinian-Israeli problem. And I think, although I'm not sure he did emphasize it one way or another, continuing to deal with what he sees as the constant threat of terrorism from groups such as Al-Qa'ida or spin-offs from Al-Qa'ida. That's all very interesting, but notice what was not said. There is nothing on Egypt, which is, after all, the central largest Arab country and a sort of a linchpin of the traditional American security architecture for the Middle East. I think not really a word. And then only the most fleeting passing reference to bringing democracy to the Middle East. He said something like, "Oh yes, and we are supporting democracy in Tunisia, from Tunisia to Myanmar," and that was about it. Well, you can contrast this not only with the previous administration, which I think rather excessively proclaimed the United States was going to work to bring democratic, friendly, liberal, capitalist stability to the Middle East, even if we had to change a few regimes to do it. And I think also it's backing away from one of the historic themes in American foreign policy generally, going back really to the beginning of the Republic, and that's the theme of idealism. If you go back really to the Founding Fathers, you see the notion that the United States is different. It's a city on a hill. It has a mission. It has a moral obligation to set things right, to set an example for others who are not as enlightened or as fortunate as we are. Well, we heard really nothing about that from the president. Well, Secretary Kerry, just a couple of days before that, sounded a similar theme. I won't quote from that, but I do have the quotes here, in which he strongly rebutted this notion that is so widespread all around the world, not just in Asia, but certainly in the Middle East, and I think in Europe as well, that the United States is on its way down. It's past its peak, and it's got to get used to being just one of a concert of big powers and not the preeminent superpower that Americans have liked to think of us as being. Susan Rice spoke at Georgetown in November, and she sounded a similar theme, that no, there's no such thing as decline. What there is a rebalancing toward Asia, a tilt, as it was known initially, that the United States was going eventually to reposition its military assets in such a way as to favor Asia, because Asia is where the action is, or more particularly Asia is where China is rising, and something needs to be done about that. 60% of American military assets, it was said, will by a certain year, not too far from now, presumably will be positioned in Asia rather than where they are. At the same time, I heard Susan Rice in another speech at the Middle East Institute in Washington in November insist, she was speaking of course to an audience of Middle East specialists, insist that while that rebalancing is happening, it will not mean any particular diminution of the very substantial military forces that the United States has all around and in almost every country of the Middle East. So in a way you're trying to, I think, have your cake and eat it too, unless you can assume that we have an ever-expanding pie or cake of military capabilities, which surely we do not, given the budgetary and economic constraints that Senator Hagel and others are having to deal with. So that is the picture. It's a picture, though, of I think a diminished agenda, diminished priorities. Let's scale back, but let's say that we're not really scaling back. It's not it's not the kind of thing that we like to hear. We like to think that we're actually going forward and advancing, but that's not what President Obama seems inclined to do. So while the administration strenuously, maybe they protest too much, insists that everything is okay and we're up and running and we're not going to decline, that is definitely not what other people think. As I mentioned, I travel a good deal in the Middle East. From Singapore. The Gulf is only 7 hours away by Qatar Airways or Emirates. And I get around, and it's rare that you hear anybody not say that the United States is losing ground, or the United States doesn't care, the United States has lost its willpower, and isn't that a shame, at least from the point of view of friendly governments and friendly elites. You certainly hear this in Egypt, Lebanon, the Gulf, and you hear it in Israel as well. You hear this in Europe as well. And in Asia, as I mentioned, definitely you hear it. I've heard this from specialists in Russia, China, Japan, and certainly in Singapore. And Asia is the area to which we are supposedly rebalancing. Now, the actual evidence so far of rebalancing, at least from the Asians' perspective, is not robust. Military redeployments so far are minimal. We noticed that 5 littoral combat ships were being deployed to Singapore, keep those Chinese under control. We learned that 1,500 Marines are being deployed to Darwin, and this elicited guffaws from a particular Indian analyst I heard in Singapore saying, well, if that's what rebalancing means, this is really a joke. Nevertheless, so they're yet to be persuaded, and lately the Japanese are certainly not thrilled at what they take to have been a blink from the Obama administration when the Chinese declared an expanded sort of air zone encroaching upon what Japan thinks is its. This was not seen as a robust kind of rebalancing to Asia, on the contrary. And the fact that for reasons that were, I suppose, effectively beyond Obama's control, he had to cancel at the last minute his own appearance at a big Asia-Pacific meeting in last fall in Indonesia, which was a very substantial symbolic setback. It's important. It was seen as important to Asian leaders, to ASEAN leaders in particular, that Obama show up to show that rebalancing really means something. But the government shut down, and that gets us. We'll get to this in a few minutes when we try to explain why we seem to be unsure, fumbling, stumbling, shooting from the hip. The government shut down. Domestic factors definitely play a role in this rather, in my view, rather mediocre performance. Now, what is this performance really all about? Well, let's talk about the Arab uprisings, first of all. And here, we notice what? Well, we notice, I think, above all, inconsistency. And this is important because if, in fact, if we may return to the kind of idealist principles that the United States has articulated for so many years in support of liberal democracy, human rights, freedom, and so forth, inconsistency tends, in the view of others, to tarnish our commitment to such things. So, in Tunisia, which in terms of U.S. interest was not all that important, when Zain Abidine al-Ali suddenly departed the country, to everybody's great surprise, I think the administration said, well, why not? That's fine. And we picked up on that. We didn't do a lot. Didn't have to do a lot. Tunisia, interestingly, is perhaps the only one of the Arab uprising countries that has moved in a relatively positive direction. In Egypt, much more complicated. In Egypt, we were slow to abandon Mubarak, but we did, belatedly. And here you see, I think, a tension that exists up to the present day and has become now much more acute as the new government of Egypt becomes more and more repressive, a tension between interests and ideals. Egypt, the Egyptian military in particular, has had an almost sort of umbilical relationship with the Pentagon, with the United States military. This goes back to the time, certainly, of Anwar Sadat. And Egypt, being where it is and what it is, has been considered a centerpiece in the U.S. Security architecture for the region. Nevertheless, when Mubarak fell, the United States moved appropriately. I think there was a hope that the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces of Egypt, which temporarily at least assumed power, would continue the relationship. But on the whole, the United States said, well, let's let's see if this actually moves towards some kind of a democratic outcome. And so we've gone back and forth on this. An American ambassador, after President Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood Party was narrowly elected president, an American ambassador said, well, yeah, let's go with that, and was roundly criticized for showing support for the Muslim Brotherhood. And that raised the hackles of the remnants of the deep state, the Mubarak state, the bureaucratic state of Egypt that had been sort of rudely shunted aside. Even while members of the Muslim Brotherhood itself said, well, we're very suspicious of the Americans and we think they're really in bed with the military. So we were caught really between two stools, and we more or less are that way to the present time. Secretary Kerry made, I think, unfortunate remarks some time ago, saying that after the military and General Sisi had overthrown Morsi in what I think we must admit is a coup, a popular coup, but a coup nonetheless. He said, well, this is probably still a step on the road to democracy. This clearly seems not to have been the case. And as we read the news from Egypt today, we see the regime of General Sisi becoming more and more repressive. I just come from a conference on Egypt at Georgetown yesterday, at which a very prominent Egyptian academic, Dr. Ahmed Shaheen, was present. He has just been indicted for terrorism, along with a good number of other Egyptian journalists, scholars, professional people. It doesn't look at all good. And the United States ends up being really blamed by both sides. The military is mad that we had supported Morsi, and now the Morsi people are mad that we seem to have acquiesced and maybe even supported a military counter-coup against Egypt's fledgling democratic exercise. So, not a great story. We could go on, and I won't go on at such length, but when we look at Libya, we see, I think, similar confusion. Here, it was actually the Europeans, and the French in particular, that wanted to help the somewhat fragmented Libyan opposition against the rule of Muammar al-Gaddafi. They pulled the United States in at the end, but I believe it was Obama who coined the phrase, well, we don't want to get too deeply involved in this. We prefer to lead from behind, which is an interesting turn of phrase, which brings to mind a verse from Gilbert and Sullivan, an enterprise of martial kind. When there was any fighting, he led his regiment from behind. He found it less exciting. And Obama did not seem to be particularly thrilled to get too deeply involved in Libya. And then, of course, we had an event, the tragedy of the murder of the American ambassador in Benghazi, which I think turned into a political asset for Obama's domestic enemies. But another, perhaps smaller example of really not being able to handle this. Don't get me wrong, I don't think this is easy. And if you or I were in these situations, what would we do in these situations of chaos? But clearly Obama wants, if possible, to pull back. But pulling back is a very messy business. In Yemen, which also had its uprising, we also, I think, led from behind. Ali Abdullah Saleh had been a staunch ally of the United States in fighting Al-Qa'ida in the Arabian Peninsula. We practiced with our drones in Yemen, perhaps before we even did this in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the Yemeni government was, all for it. So he was an ally, but he was also, of course, quite toxic. He couldn't hold the country together. And the United States said, well, what shall we do? And in this case, we left it to the mediation of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which came up with a plan for reconciliation among the various Yemeni factions, which actually, in a very odd sort of way, seems to have worked to some extent. But the Americans were, again, pulling back. Why do we do this? The shadow of Iraq. It's the shadow of Iraq that hangs and over Obama, over Washington. The bad lessons of Iraq have been maybe too well learned. So that's Yemen. Then there was the case of Bahrain. And here we're getting into really touchy territory because Bahrain, as you know, is a member of the Arab Gulf Cooperation Council. It is connected to Saudi Arabia. Bahrain is a couple of little islands just off the Saudi coast. It's connected by a causeway. To Saudi Arabia, Bahrain is practically sovereign Saudi territory. And when a citizen uprising took place in Bahrain, it presented a real challenge. Would the United States and the rest of the world support what appeared, I think quite rightly, to be a citizen protest against a regime well-known, a monarchy well-known for corruption and intolerance and so forth? But that didn't really happen. Maybe it didn't happen because the United States Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. Maybe it didn't happen because the Saudis said, don't mess with Bahrain, it's too important to us, and if you don't support the Al-Khalifa royal dynasty, we will. And they did. They sent in troops to help the Bahraini authorities put down the uprising, although in fact it's an uprising that continues at a low level to this very day. But what they did, what the Bahrainis and the Saudis did, was to recast this little story, not in terms of a citizen uprising for democracy and participation, but as a sectarian power grab. Because, as you probably know, the vast majority of the Bahrainis are Shiite Muslims, whereas the Al-Khalifa dynasty is Sunni. And so it was seen as a Sunni-Shia problem, which the Saudis do not take lightly. And moreover, it was seen as an Iranian power grab. And that moves us into another domain of the Middle East conflicts, the domain of international relations, of regional relations, and of the power balance and contestation in the Gulf area in particular between Saudi Arabia and the Sunni monarchies plus some other countries, including for now Egypt, against Iran, the Iranian, Syrian, Hezbollah, Shiite axis as they see it. So it becomes a matter of big power politics, not just a matter of a local uprising. And then we come to Syria. Well, we can talk about this perhaps in the Q&A, but it appears to me that in this case, the administration really did stumble. They really didn't know quite how to handle this. Obama had laid down a red line regarding chemical weapons, even though chemical weapons are, if we may speak bluntly, a relatively minor means of killing people compared to the other ways in which the Syrian regime has killed people, and the Syrian opposition has also killed people. But the Syrian uprising gained, I think, certain attraction in Washington, and initially the administration thought that Bashar al-Assad would fall like overripe fruit, just as Ben Ali and Gaddafi and Mubarak had, and Saleh had or were falling. But that actually didn't happen. It turned out that the Syrian regime was much more durable than anybody had thought. And so the United States, as you have noticed, I think from the papers, has said, well, yes, we'll help the opposition, but then it turns out that parts of the opposition seem to be affiliated with what we call in Washington jihadis, that is to say Al-Qa'ida Islamist extremists who are extremely hostile to our friends in the region and to us ourselves, and therefore this is an opposition movement that is tainted. So even though there is no love lost for Assad, remember the American ambassador in Syria, Mr. Ford, was going around before the uprisings broke out and just after, meeting with opposition groups, sort of saying, go for it. And so we in some ways encouraged that, and then it turned out not to be working out so well. And we've come then to the present pass where last summer, you'll remember, we were just about on the verge of attacking Syria for all kinds of reasons, when it would seem like almost a throwaway remark, Mr. Kerry said, well, if they would get serious about getting rid of their chemical weapons, we'll think again. The Russians picked up on this. If they didn't actually instigate it, they picked up on it immediately. And suddenly, the diplomatic momentum, I think, shifted toward the Russians. I think they did very well at this. And they said, okay, well, let's see if we can get a chemical weapons deal. And they did. They got one. And they're slowly getting rid of these, which is all very well. But to the opposition, they felt, wait a minute, that's not the real game that's going on here. That's just a sideshow. And the problem with this sideshow is that in getting the Syrian government to commit to this deal, you're actually legitimizing this government further, and therefore making it even less likely that the United States will support this opposition. So here we are. And we have a veteran American diplomat, Ryan Crocker, who had been an ambassador in Syria as well as practically everywhere else. There's a problem. Who said recently very bluntly, well, we knew, he said, I don't think we were surprised to hear this, we knew all the way along that even if the United States at the beginning had helped the Syrian opposition with weapons, or even airstrikes, something, it wouldn't have worked because the Syrian regime is too strong. You might as well just, suck it up and deal with it, because the opposition, the jihadis, he said, are much worse than the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And here we are. Talks are going on. Mr. Kerry is in Switzerland. And we are, again, not dominating the situation, but sort of, should we say, leading from behind. Well, so on the whole, it strikes me as we've fumbled the Arab uprisings. There's the question of the Iran nuclear issue. And here we have, again, a device, and I think possibly a very promising one, in which the United States, had there not been an opening to Iran and this interim agreement, which has recently been signed, we were probably on a path to war. If it wasn't us, it would have been the Israelis. And we've played this record a few times already. There have been times when we were sort of counting the months before there would be an Israeli-American military strike on Iran. But suddenly, with the election of Rouhani, there's an opening, and Mr. Kerry and Mr. Obama, despite very strong opposition, or at least skepticism in the U.S. Congress and in U.S. opinion, are trying to see if diplomacy might not actually work. All very well, but from a broader realist perspective, one would say, here we are dealing with these people, giving them legitimacy, acquiescing, in effect, to a process that will lead to our acceptance of a certain kind of Iranian role in the region. And this is a process that we ourselves had not really initiated. It really it couldn't have happened, I think, again, without the Russians, with the Chinese somewhat behind them. Nevertheless, in the grading process, I have to say, I think that this initiative deserves maybe a B. We don't know whether it's going to work, but I think we should not gripe too much about this particular initiative. So it's not all black. But here we are, and who likes us anymore over there? The Saudi Arabia and the GCC are mightily unhappy with us because they see us giving in to Iran, allowing Iran, even if they give up their nuclear ambitions, whatever they actually may be, allowing Iran to sort of be recognized by the international community. People talk about bringing Iran back into the international community if this diplomatic process continues beyond the 6 months. And that's not great news for the Saudis and the Gulf people. And they think, well, where are you Americans? You're supposed to be on our side, and here you are dealing with the enemy. Problem. At the same time, these are the same allies who, either by accident or design, have poured large amounts of money, resources, into supporting extremist opposition militias and armed groups in Syria, which has, again, sort of poisoned the well of the opposition as far as the United States is concerned. So one has to wonder, really, with friends like these, well, you see what I mean. So, and after all, not only do they seem to allow the funding for what Washington calls bad guys, but they're also mounting a substantial counter-revolution against the Arab uprisings that have happened in the larger, more populated states to the west of them. Is that a project that we really want to support or not? Again, you have to balance off ideals and interests. On Palestine and Israel, again, I mean, I've been writing about U.S. Middle East policy for a very long time, and on this issue, it's been such a sad story because one always says, well, the United States is totally hamstrung by Israel. Israel leads us by the nose, and the Israel lobby leads us domestically by the nose, and that explains why things have never really worked out. Camp David never came truly to fruition. The Oslo process ground to a halt. And now, when one would have thought, if you wanted an issue to give up on, maybe this is the one, but suddenly there was it Obama or was it Kerry? But for whatever reason, Kerry has tried to revive this sickly diplomatic process, and they are going about it, although the smart money says that they're not going to have any more luck than their predecessors. And the Israeli ministers, as you probably have read, have ridiculed Secretary Kerry's efforts in this respect. And the Palestinians think, well, I mean, what can you expect from the Americans? But he's trying. Now, it may be that ultimately only the Palestinians and the Israelis all by themselves can settle their problems, and that the United States, if past experience is any guide, is not going to, it just doesn't seem to have the ability or the balance to bring the sides together. He's trying again. And even though I can't be optimistic, I do think that this is a move on the positive side of the ledger. And then finally on the issue of terrorism, which is one which American public opinion feels very strongly about. The latest Pew polls indicate that Americans really feel that Al-Qa'ida and things like it are a big problem, and they support strong measures against it. But even so, the question has arisen with the Snowden revelations and others, do the costs outweigh the benefits? The Snowden revelations reveal NSA spying on a vast scale. The use of drones is hugely counterproductive in the areas where they have been used, especially Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen. And in his speech, to his credit, I think, Obama said, I'm thinking of, cutting back on drones or a little bit, and I'm thinking of cutting back a little bit on our mass spying efforts. Implicitly, I think, recognizing what recent reports and distinguished groups have said are essentially, if not counterproductive, at least not very productive efforts. So on the terrorism front, again, maybe there's an effort to pull in a little bit, and it certainly is a problem for him because this is one area where the public really does feel strongly. So here we are. The performance, therefore, is not altogether bad, but it's not surely terrific. And on the global and regional stage, I think as we look at the past few years, Russia and China are gaining ground. I think Putin has scored some points, has taken some initiatives in the Middle East, whatever you may think of his other policies. A Syria compromise, leaving Assad in power, means, I think, a substantial victory for the Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Russia, China axis, and a setback for the U.S. moderate Sunni Gulf-led counter-coalition, if you will. And then there's the question, as we look on the global stage, of linkages. And what I mean by this is decline in the Middle East, or the impression of decline in the Middle East, leads to the impression of decline in other parts of the world. And I'll just illustrate this with an anecdote. At the recent meeting of the Middle East Studies Association in New Orleans, I had lunch with a Chinese analyst who works at a think tank in Shanghai. And we were talking about Obama's backing off of using force in Syria and backing off from really substantial support with lethal weapons for the Syrian opposition. And what he said was, this is what he thinks. He says he thinks that our leadership, the Chinese leadership, that is, when it saw Obama pull back on Syria, they thought, clearly he doesn't seem to have the stomach for the use of power, even though the United States has more potential power, military power, at its disposal than anybody else. They said, well, if he doesn't have the stomach for using power in Syria, maybe we can be a little bit more forward and even aggressive in the East China Sea. Because we don't think the Americans are really going to complain that much. They'll complain, of course, but it doesn't look like they really have the heart to get, to really flex their muscles. So was it just a coincidence that the Chinese then declared this expanded air zone? I don't know, but that at least is a story about linkage, how the impression of decline in one area kind of spreads to other areas. So let me wind up here with what? How do we explain this uneven performance by the Obama administration in the Middle East? Well, I think definitely we have to look at the domestic political environment here in the United States. And I would identify the following factors. First of all, a poor understanding of the region on the part of decision makers. Not just the intelligence community, the CIA and NSA and all of the intelligence organizations, even though the intelligence community doesn't have a sterling record in predicting important things. They misread Saddam on nuclear weapons. They misread Saddam on support for terrorism. They missed the uprisings altogether. That was a huge surprise. They miscalculated on Assad's durability. So that's a problem. Also, I think when we look at the domestic environment, we have to look at the Congress, and we have to look at the basic kind of structure of the two-party system, the Tea Party, and the milieu in which this administration or any administration has to function. And of course, the whole theme, at least as constructed by the media after the State of the Union message, was, well, you know, he's stuck. Congress will block him on practically everything of importance, so he's going to go around them and do other things that he can do without their permission, even though those things are not particularly important. So when we look at Congress dealing in the area of foreign policy, it's not famous for subtlety or flexibility, as we know. Obama's got a big problem with a congressional resolution that will require the U.S. to impose new sanctions on Iran just at a time when this fledgling, frail, but promising diplomatic agreement on Iranian nuclears is just beginning to get underway. That's not helpful. Then, of course, there's always the blank check for Israel. And that's just sort of a constant. It has to be, he just seems to have his hands tied. Not that he is being tied up unwillingly on this, but I think the fact that in his latest pronouncements, as you may have noticed, he is speaking of ironclad U.S. security guarantees for Israel as a Jewish state. Jewish state. This is a new term. This is a new element that has been introduced into the diplomatic discourse and the negotiating process between Israel and Palestinians. That's a problem, considering that 20% of Israel inside the Green Line is actually not Jewish. But we have to do it because these are domestic pressures. So there's a problem. But I think, to be fair, we have to look more broadly, and even outside the government, even outside the intelligence community, and even among the think tanks, and even within our academic community, we haven't been all that great either. We political scientists who work on the Middle East spend most of our time trying to figure out why authoritarianism works so well. Very interesting work has been done on upgrading authoritarianism and so on and so on. And if there has been a consensus among that small band of Middle East political scientists, it is that, well, authoritarianism is there to stay, and this is how it works, and we should study how it works. Which is fine, but there are opportunity costs here, and that means if you're going to spend a lot of time studying that, you're not going to spend so much time studying what's going on down in society. Not to say that there hasn't been some work, not a lot, but there has been some work, and not mostly by political scientists, more by anthropologists and sociologists, on social movements, political movements, and so forth, questions of identity, role of social media, etc., etc. There is some work, but apparently not enough. And one suspects that the operating assumption of policymakers at the highest level is that society is kind of an inert, monolithic thing, and we don't necessarily need to pay so much attention to it. So, there's a problem. And I think, as well, in the broader community, the academic community, and the public debate, there's also a long-standing tendency, particularly in the public media, to demonize Islam. That doesn't help. And I think in addition, arising perhaps from these other, perhaps oversimplified assumptions, there's a certain arrogance on the part of the attentive publics to foreign policy that we can engineer democratic and liberal regime change, that this is doable. We can do it. Certainly George W. Bush thought we could do it. But obviously we seem to be unable at least to do it all by ourselves. So we have a situation where an administration is boxed in within its own ranks between the realists and the idealists, between the Samantha Powers and the Ryan Crockers, as it were. We have Hawks versus Thugs, so on and so on. We have Republicans, and we have the Tea Party. We have Senator McCain, Senator Graham going out there and sort of conducting their own foreign policy in the Middle East. We have public opinion and the media commentary, some of which are quite toxic and many of which are uninformed. And above all, as I said earlier, there's the shadow of Iraq hanging over all of this. An unnecessary war that was quite costly to the United States and quite disastrous, really, for Iraq and for the Iraqis. It's still going on. We're not there, but fighting's still going on. And that's true of Afghanistan as well. So one can understand why the president got elected on saying, I want to get us out of Iraq. Now I'm trying to get us out of Afghanistan. It doesn't sound like a great power flexing its muscles. It sounds rather, to the contrary. But that's what the shadow of Iraq and Afghanistan, and largely, I suppose, the shadow of 9/11 and the war on terror as it came to be conceptualized, has led to and contributed, I think, to a sense of a failure of will or a lack of enthusiasm for a region that maybe isn't actually so important anymore. So in conclusion, I would say this. To his credit, Obama is trying to lower the American military profile and the image, quite prevalent throughout the region, of American sort of neo-imperialism. I think the Iran initiative is creative, possibly good. And I think he's right, if late, in tackling again the Palestine-Israel issue, which really is sort of the substratum of all that ails this region. The instincts are good, the performance is mediocre. We're recognizing, I think, there's a recognition that much of the Middle East, this is what they feel, is not actually so important. Even the oil issue isn't so urgent anymore, as we've heard when we hear the news from North Dakota. Israel is relatively secure. Doesn't need much more than supportive words and the usual subsidy. It doesn't really need that. But there are no political costs for that. But the execution, I think, has been mediocre, fumbling, shooting from the hip. It's over Syria. It's hard for the superpower, the world's only superpower, accustomed to owning the Middle East, to have to share it with others, and even to put up with a Russia, China, Iran, Syria axis. And with a decline of U.S. influence and the continuing chaos in the region, which is fed by miserable economic conditions in the populated countries, the threat of extremist terrorism, with an Islamist face usually, remains. If we think of worst case scenarios, well, Al-Qa'ida resurgent, the collapse of the Saudi and or other Gulf regimes. Can we live with that? Maybe so. Mearsheimer, in his quite provocative article, thinks we can live with that. Leave it to others who have more vital interests. China, for example. Hand it to them. They're the ones that really need the oil from the Middle East. So, on balance, I'll give them a C. And maybe this retreat is not such a bad thing after all. And maybe the Middle East really isn't as important as we have tended to think it is. Hegemony is expensive in human and material costs. We could use the money for domestic infrastructure rebuilding. We seem to have hindered more than helped political reforms in so many of these places. Even though we have huge military power, and we actually are augmenting our military power in the Gulf with new radar installations and so forth for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. Even when we have that, obviously it doesn't automatically translate to political influence. So what to do? This is not a terrifically stimulating conclusion. Be multilateral. we sort of have to anyway, husband our limited resources, save the hard power for emergencies only. And I think ultimately, in the long run, the best weapon in fighting extremism is cultural and educational activity of which, and resources of which we actually have a great deal. We can do a lot of good things in those fields that don't impinge directly on the political arena. So, when all is said and done, there's still, I think, we all feel there's an ethical dilemma. What will we do? What do we do in the face of massacres and even genocide? Do we have a responsibility to intervene, to protect? We can't really solve this question really easily. We can't really avoid the classic formulation of international politics, which is the currency of the realm in international politics is power. How do we deal with it? And on that, I'll stop and I'll try to entertain any comments or questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much.